Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
They vanished without a trace. 115 men, women, and children gone. No bodies, no graves. Only a single word carved into a tree, Croatoan. A secret token, he called it, left behind as a sign. Here it was, Croatoan, etched into the post. It seemed to explain everything, but it explained nothing. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke Colony remained America's most chilling enigma, one of its oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened right in our own backyard. Now, in 2025, scientists have broken the silence. What they uncovered isn't just shocking. It began in the blistering summer of 1587. Under the searing Atlantic sun, 3 English ships slid into the shallows and anchored off Roanoke Island, a remote, wild spit of land off what is now the coast of North Carolina. Aboard were 115 souls, not conquerors, but dreamers. They stepped onto the soil of a new world, carrying the fragile hope of a new beginning. They weren't the first to try. 2 earlier expeditions had failed, ruined by violence, starvation, and chaos. But this time felt different. Led by the thoughtful and determined John White, they came with families, not fighters. They came to stay. Among them was a symbol of hope, Virginia Dare, White's granddaughter, the first English child born on American soil. Her birth was more than a joy, it was a statement. England had arrived to stay. They worked beneath towering pines and oaks, raising a modest wooden fort, planting crops, and forming cautious ties with native tribes. The land was raw, beautiful, and merciless. Still, they endured. Then, just as their lives began to take root, White returned to England for more supplies, and when he came back, nothing remained. A voyage he expected would take only a few months stretched into years. Europe was on fire. England was locked in a deadly standoff with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I had seized every seaworthy vessel to fight the looming threat of the Spanish Armada. John White was trapped. 3 long years, powerless, watching the days bleed away while imagining what horrors might be unfolding across the ocean. When he finally returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, the silence struck first. The harbor was still, the air thick and unnatural. The fort stood exactly as he had left it, palisades upright, gates unbroken, structures intact, but not a soul remained. No laughter, no voices, no smoke curling from the chimneys. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, refusing to speak. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no scattered belongings, no hastily dug graves or bones left to time, just one word carved deep into the entrance post, Croatoan, and nearby 3 unfinished letters, C-R-O. White's pulse quickened. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to an allied indigenous tribe. It was also the agreed-upon signal, the place they would carve if forced to move. There was no cross, no distress symbol. Perhaps, White thought, they had left willingly. Perhaps they were alive. But fate turned against him. As he prepared to sail to Croatoan, a violent storm erupted. His ship's anchor snapped, supplies ran low, his crew, cold and defeated, refused to press on. With a shattered heart, White abandoned the search and returned to England, never to see the New World again. His journal is all that remains, trembling with restrained panic and hollow regret. It wasn't what he saw that haunted him, it was what he failed to do. And because of that, an entire colony, a seed of England, vanished without a trace. In the centuries that followed, Roanoke became a riddle. Historians dug, theorists obsessed. By the early 1600, whispers reached Jamestown. Settlers reported tribes whose members had gray eyes, spoke broken English, and claimed descent from white ancestors. Some had lighter features, hair, and bone structure that didn't match the native lineage. There were even rumors of hand-drawn maps showing distant villages with English-style buildings, perfectly aligned, too precise to be native-made. But every clue dissolved into shadow. Every lead ended in ash. In time, darker theories emerged. Some believed the colonists had been slaughtered by nearby tribes after fragile diplomacy collapsed. Others whispered of starvation, madness, or even cannibalism driven by a brutal winter. A few pointed toward the Spanish, who patrolled the Atlantic seaboard in secret, erasing rival settlements without a trace. Then came tales of curses, of sacred burial grounds disturbed, of land that rejected the settlers like a body repelling an infection. Despite no clear answers, the search never stopped. Excavations and studies pressed on. Archaeologists scoured Roanoke and its surrounding regions, unearthing fragments of pottery, rusted weapons, and beads. Artifacts that could have belonged to the colonists or could have come from anywhere. The line between truth and legend grew razor thin. Just like the Dare Stone, a relic said to carry the voice of Eleanor White Dare, in 1937 it surfaced, a carved rock bearing a desperate message from Eleanor, mother of Virginia Dare. It spoke of disease, death, and unbearable grief. The nation was spellbound. Then came more stones, too many. Eventually, scholars dismissed most as forgeries, if not all. Hope crumbled once again into doubt. Yet Roanoke refused to fade. It haunted the American imagination. A mystery with just enough evidence to provoke belief and just enough silence to breed legend. Centuries passed. Technology surged ahead. DNA tests were proposed. LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar swept across the Carolina coast. Still, nothing. An entire community had vanished into the trees, and all they left behind were questions. Then came the map. Like many great discoveries, it started small. In 2012, a researcher at the British Museum was studying a faded 16th century watercolor titled La Virginière Par, created by none other than John White. The map, delicate and centuries old, had long been a focus of scholarly curiosity. But that day something odd stood out. A barely noticeable patch, subtle enough to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. Using backlighting, an old technique meant to reveal hidden sketches and erased marks, the researcher uncovered it, the outline of a square-shaped fort, faint but deliberate, concealed beneath the surface. Hidden beneath the patch near the meeting point of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers, the mark had been made with invisible ink, or iron gall, its secrets preserved by time and chance. What made this discovery so extraordinary wasn't just the hidden nature of the marking, it was where it was found. Exactly 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. That distance wasn't random. It matched a cryptic note buried in John White's own journal, written before his fateful return to England in 1587. In it, he recorded that the Roanoke colonists, who would later disappear without a trace, had planned to move 50 miles into the Main. Long overlooked, that phrase suddenly held new weight. Why had White concealed this fort? Theories erupted. Some believed he meant to shield its location from Spanish spies, who prowled the New World to sabotage English settlements. Others whispered that White never returned, not because he couldn't, but because he feared what he might find: failure, disease, or something worse. The map, once just a sun-faded artifact, had become a cipher in America's oldest mystery. The find ignited the archaeological world. Soon after, the First Colony Foundation, a North Carolina-based group dedicated to solving the Roanoke mystery, launched a full investigation. Under the leadership of renowned archaeologist Nick Lucchetti, they focused on the area around the Albemarle Sound in Bertie County. This new site was given a name that reflected both caution and hope: Site X. Site X and the Ghosts of Bertie. Excavations began with high expectations, but also skepticism. The landscape was thick with pine and tangled brush, far from the classic image of an English fort. As the dig grew, no walls emerged, no trenches, no barracks, nothing that clearly said fort. Then, just beyond the edge of an abandoned native village called Metaquem, the soil began to whisper. Layer by layer, it yielded clues. Fragments of English pottery, buried beneath centuries of earth. These weren't decorative or trade goods. They were functional. Bowls, jars, cooking pots. Many bore the greenish glaze typical of Surrey, Hampshire wares from Elizabethan England. And one detail stood out more than any other. There were no clay tobacco pipes. The settlers of Jamestown, founded in 1607, famously left pipe fragments everywhere. But the Roanoke colonists came earlier, before that trend. The absence wasn't a mistake, it was a timestamp. These pieces weren't left by chance, they suggested not just presence, but habitation. Someone had lived here, cooked here, stored food here. As interest mounted, the team expanded their search with ground-penetrating radar. Just 2 miles away, the soil revealed something else. Site Y. This time, the artifacts widened in scope. Fragments of European ceramics from multiple regions, hinting at a merging of cultures. Quiet, buried evidence that the lost colony may not have vanished, but transformed. This discovery opened the door to a possibility few had dared to explore, a theory as unsettling as it was logical. A new story began to take shape, one not of a single vanishing, but of dispersal. What if the colonists hadn't disappeared, but splintered, intentionally scattering in a final, desperate attempt to survive? Some may have blended into tribes like the Croatoan, others could have pushed inland, building secret settlements under the protection of sympathetic native leaders. Site X and Site Y, separated by a sliver of forest and 4 centuries of silence, began to hint at something deeper. This was not the story of failure. It was fragmentation, not disappearance, but transformation. And the deeper the archaeologists dug, the more Roanoke's fate appeared to be a mosaic of decisions, endurance, and quiet adaptation. But this was only half the story. While Site X captured headlines with its tantalizing discoveries, another excavation unfolded quietly, over 200 miles southeast, on the salt-whipped sands of Hatteras Island, once known as Croatoan. Legends had long claimed that the colonists had gone there. Now, the sand itself began to speak. At the center of this effort was British archaeologist Mark Horton, working alongside the Croatoan Archaeological Society, led by local historian Scott Dawson. Where Site X suggested relocation, Hatteras told a story of assimilation. Beneath shifting dunes and centuries of coastal debris, researchers uncovered the unmistakable traces of English presence. A rusted rapier hilt, corroded gun parts, and most startling of all, a slate writing tablet still bearing faint English script. These weren't the discarded remnants of traders. They were personal, practical, deliberate. Someone had lived there. Even more compelling were the oral traditions of the Lumbee and other indigenous families, passed down through generations. Stories of white settlers who had joined the Croatoan people, intermarried, raised children, and built lives together. Long dismissed as myth, these tales suddenly echoed the artifacts in the ground. Scott Dawson's 2020 book, The Lost Colony and Hatteras Island, documented it all, laying out a provocative argument. The colony hadn't vanished, it had fractured. Some went inland, but others, perhaps many, had remained on Croatoan. They weren't lost, they were hiding in plain sight, disguised by time, by silence, by history's indifference. And then came the most daring idea of all. What if both stories were true? What if the colony hadn't collapsed but evolved? To test the theory, archaeologists left behind their shovels and embraced forensic science. Ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the forest floor. LiDAR peeled away digital layers of foliage, exposing ancient landscape scars, fence lines, post holes, hearths, ghosts of settlements long buried. The most haunting clues came not from structures, but from the things people left behind. Fragments of tools, pottery, personal objects. Researchers compared samples from sites X, Y, and Hatteras, mapping a pattern that seemed impossible to ignore. Then the timeline itself began to shift. The artifacts at Roanoke sites didn't match those of Jamestown or Plymouth. No clay tobacco pipes, no post-1600 ceramics. Instead, the items aligned perfectly with a pre-1600 English presence, the exact moment when the Roanoke colonists vanished. These weren't echoes of later migrations. They were direct traces of the lost colony itself. Then came the bombshell, DNA. Buried in the genetic code of local indigenous populations, researchers found markers consistent with Western European ancestry, centuries old, not the result of 17th century mingling, but something far older, something aligned, suspiciously, with the year 1587. At first they said it quietly, then louder. If this was true, then Jamestown, Plymouth, and the Mayflower were not the beginning, they were already late. The first chapter of America may have been written by a colony that didn't die, but lived, adapted, and was simply forgotten. But not everyone agreed. Each new discovery stirred a new debate. Roanoke had become a battlefield between believers and skeptics. Some saw the artifacts as evidence, others as coincidence. Dr. Charles Ewan, a veteran archaeologist, warned of confirmation bias, accusing researchers of chasing theories, not truth. They're trying to prove a theory, he said, not disprove it. That's dangerous for science. Scott Dawson disagreed. A Croatoan native whose family had lived on Hatteras for generations, he believed the answer had always been in plain sight. They went to Croatoan, he said. Site X, he argued, was too far, too hostile, surrounded by tribes the colonists had antagonized. It would have been suicide. Even within the first colony foundation, there was no consensus. One faction believed in the split theory, coastal and inland migrations. Others dismissed the inland route, arguing that artifacts found there may have belonged to earlier scouts. But those artifacts, silver rings, English blades, fragments of 16th century pottery, were hard to dismiss. Enough to suggest a story, never enough to prove it. Still, the tools improved. Ground radar, drones, DNA sequencing, radiocarbon dating. Bit by bit, the evidence accumulated. Quiet, stubborn, impossible to ignore. Then came 2025, and everything changed. A cold February morning, a patch of dry earth near the Croatoan River, close to Site X. The team from the First Colony Foundation wasn't expecting much, but they found her. A burial, supine, head to the west, feet to the east. A Christian grave, no grave goods, no markings. Just bones, weathered but whole. And she was European? DNA proved it. Female. Not from Jamestown, not from the all-male 1585 expedition. She had lived and died there, which meant others had too. For centuries, we imagined the Roanoke colonists swallowed by the wilderness, but now, a single grave shattered that myth. This is terrifying, one archaeologist whispered. Not because we found her, but because now we know others were there too. They didn't vanish, they didn't die in one tragic moment. They fractured, moved, survived. Now 2 paths stretch from the ruins, 2 possible fates. Some fled southeast to Hatteras Island. There, among the Croatoan, they found sanctuary. English tools, genetic traces, oral histories, all point to the same conclusion. This wasn't ambition, it was surrender. Quiet, necessary, and devastating. Others turned inland, toward the woods of Metaquum. They vanished deeper, perhaps seeking freedom, perhaps escape. Their motives weren't strategic, they were survival. Drought, disease, starvation, fear. And fear, more than anything, destroyed unity. When trust dissolved, so did the colony. So they ran, not together, but as scattered threads, some to the sea, some to the trees, all into silence. Roanoke's story was never one of disappearance. It was one of decisions made in desperation, of courage, of terror. And now it is being rewritten. For centuries we treated Roanoke as a ghost story, an unsolved riddle, but it was something else, a hidden origin, a story about people who risked everything, only to vanish not from existence, but from memory. Their voices were buried beneath roots and rivers, erased by weather, time, and willful forgetting. What they left behind was not failure, but the cost of survival. A single word carved into wood, Croatoan. What makes this terrifying isn't that we didn't know, it's that we almost never asked. They weren't lost, we just stopped listening. What if they were never gone, just waiting to be found?